So the Ark Encounter, let's take you on a tour. Ken Ham invited me 10 years ago to see the Creation Museum, and this year to see the Ark Encounter. Got this VIP Creation Museum pass. Noah's Ark at the Ark Encounter theme park is the largest freestanding timber-framed structure in the world. There's no other wooden construction of its kind in the world today. 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, 51 feet high. That's based on the biblical dimensions. 155 meters long, 25.9 meters wide, and 15.5 meters high. Based on the Bible's dimensions of 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, using the Hebrew long cubit of 20.4 inches or 51.8 centimeters. 3.1 million board feet of timber was used for the Ark structure. That's not counting the wood in exhibits. That's just for the Ark itself. This is the open day. On the 7th of the 7th, from Genesis 7, verse 7. In board feet, that would be 612 miles or 985 kilometers, the distance between Cape Town and Kimberley or Cape Town and Bloemfontein, driving by road. That's a lot of wood. Amish craftsmen and carpenters were primarily responsible for the construction of the timber frame structure. Now, you know the Amish people still use horse and buggies. They very much are trying to stay at 19th century technology for simple lifestyles. They want to focus on the relationship with God, and they want to be in the world but not of it. And so they've gone on a technological side there, but they deal with wood, and there's no better wood carpenter people in the world today. So because they always deal with wood, they got our mission to construct the Ark, and they're the engineers. They were because these people, like this man, he's been dealing with wood and saws and axes since he was a little boy. The Ark includes 290,000 board feet of bamboo flooring, about 55 miles or 88 kilometers. 67,000 holes were drilled in the heavy timber. A total of 300,000 screws were used. 50,000 wooden pegs, bolts, washers, and nuts. 95 tons of steel plates and connections were used. Now you may say, well, why are they using steel? Well, remember, they have to, it's an exhibit. There's a lot of people coming through. In fact, I think 1 million in the first year. They've got to fit certain building codes as well, also for firefighting. I mean, everything from sprinkler systems to counter fire. There's a whole lot of requirements for a building that you're going to use for public exhibits in the United States, more than we would even have here. So that's why they also needed steel. But the steel is mostly on the side for the support structures that they've got, elevators, lifts for people who are handicapped and things like this. But the actual Ark, you can see, is made of wood. They have huge 66 lodge poles, each 55 feet high, which are Douglas fir and Elderman spruce harvested in Washington and Montana states. The Ark is built on 102 piers, each 15 feet high. The Ark's keel is 3.8 meters from the ground, and the roof of the Ark is 24.3 meters from the ground, with a fin that extends even higher. The Ark's 132 exhibit bays house world-class exhibits with fascinating details on geology, history, technology, the world before the flood. For example, who was Noah and how could he have built the Ark? How could Noah have learned the skills he needed to build the Ark? We know that God gives each person talents and abilities to accomplish the purpose he assigns them, but like people today, Noah surely developed his God-given abilities throughout his lifetime. Now, what does the Bible say about Noah? He walked with God, Genesis 6, verse 9. He is a righteous man and a preacher of righteousness, we read in Ezekiel, Peter, and Genesis. And Genesis and Hebrews tells us he faithfully followed God's instructions. Now, many people depict Noah as some farmer looking after the chickens. But isn't it more likely that Noah was a shipbuilder and God called him because he was experienced in building ships? Or maybe he was a farmer when he was first called, and then he learned shipbuilding by going around the different harbors and learned how to build ships before he started to build his own. At any rate, at 500 years of age, Noah and his wife had their first sons. And before long, Shem and Ham and Japheth each had married a wife. And with so few godly people left on earth, Noah's faithfulness and righteous ways brought derision and hatred from his neighbors. Genesis 6:13. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Now we read that Noah did everything God has commanded him. So they've got exhibits like these. This year's a talking exhibit, and you can ask any question of him, and there's about 60 or 70 questions that he answers. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is really good technology. And, of course, there's scrolls, and one of the questions is, could Noah read and write? Yes, of course he could read and write. There's a lot of evidence that the ancient peoples were literate, completely literate. And so they've got different wooden type exhibits, you'd imagine, and papyrus and the types of writings that they would have had, which would have come from reeds. And that's what a library might have looked like at that time. And, of course, some of the arts here, you'd imagine the tree of life in the Garden of Eden that was denied to the ancestors. And you can see quite a bit of the technology that we know that ancient men at about the time would have had. And so those are the kind of tools depicted. And they show one of the sons would have been a carpenter, surely, because there's a huge amount of carpentry that was required in the ark. But we know that Tubal-Cain had all kinds of metalwork, and so surely another son was quite specialized in metalwork. You could imagine that there was a metalworker amongst the family. And the call comes in Genesis 6:14-17. You shall make an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it with pitch and inside. And let's get rid of that. How do I get rid of this? Yeah. You shall make an ark of gopher wood and make rooms in the ark and cover it with pitch inside and outside. And here's how you shall make it. The ark's length shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. Make a window for the ark, finishing it to a cubit from above, and set the door on the ark's side. Build it with a lower, a second, and a third deck. Behold, I'll bring flood waters on the earth to destroy all flesh under heaven, in which is the breath of life, and everything in the earth shall die. So, big question, how could the ark have been built? Well, as you're queuing to go into the ark, well, I didn't have to queue because I was allowed in a couple of hours before the normal people were, being on a VIP pass to do journalistic articles on it. But they would have been using, of course, carts like this, carrying both creatures and foodstuffs in the different pottery vessels and so on. But God equips his people for his work, first of all, by us acquiring skills. And surely Noah had studied shipbuilding, perhaps been involved in shipbuilding for much of his life, and his sons would have specialized in both woodwork, metalwork, and caring for animals, so that you would have had the different skills necessary for it. And the call comes, and it's very specific as to what they would have done. And knowing about the ancient technology of both the Greeks and the Phoenicians in shipbuilding, which probably was a carryover from Noah's ark, they could see, how can you build a vessel strong enough that's not going to break up, considering the size, on the ocean in the middle of the tumultuous storm of the flood? There would have been layers of wood. Wouldn't have just been one single wood structure. You need multiple layers, and you need a lot of wooden pegs with a couple of perhaps metal pegs too. But so they're showing here what they have built this ark with and the kind of technology they believe was used at that time. This is extremely strong, multi-layered, and again, as I said, once you've got wooden pegs, it won't leak like metal might rust and so on and decay, but the wood, when it gets wet, swells, gets thicker, not less. One of the first things you see as you come in is the Noah's Ark model. Now, how can everything fit? Well, this ark, built to the biblical dimensions, is designed to accommodate 1,398 different animal kinds, which they think is the irreducible minimum. They would have needed 322,000 gallons of water, which they could have had 95,000 stored in storage vessels, 285,000 gallons stored in cisterns. And in rain capture, they had such a huge roof area, they could have captured a huge amount of water just from rain capture on the roof. They'd have needed at least 40 tons of food, of grains, seeds, nuts, preserved fruit, vegetables, possibly even live insects. 15,000 storage vessels that they've calculated for staying there, and that's enough for 1.5 years' worth. And remember, the animal kinds included would have been land-dependent, air-breathing. They didn't need to bring sharks on board, or whales, obviously. When they opened the Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town, they had a big billboard saying, "Come see the creatures that Noah forgot." And when they put that up, my 8-year-old Andrea said, "That's stupid. Noah didn't forget any animals. He didn't need any of the sea creatures in the ark. They would have managed in the ocean." So obviously, that's a bit of a silly comment. But 85% of the animals would have weighed under 10 kilos or 22 pounds. 7% of the animals would have weighed between 22 pounds and 220 pounds. And then 8% would have been over that. So how big was the ark? Well, that's the Titanic, the largest ship made to man to that stage. That's the ark. Here's a Statue of Liberty. You can see a Boeing 747 jet. So you could have fitted 447 tractor trailers or containers, like the containers we offloaded at the mission, which is 20 foot, about 18 tons. They could have fitted 447 in there. This is the dimensions of the ark. You could have fitted in a huge amount of storage materials and animals. Bearing in mind that not all the animals would have come in the biggest. For example, you didn't have to have the largest elephants. You could have had juvenile elephants. You didn't necessarily have to have the largest Tyrannosaurus Rex. You could have had a small one. So it all fits. And they've looked at this from every side in terms of animal husbandry, in terms of the vegetation they would need, the food, and so on. Okay, so how could they have looked after all animals with just 8 people? Well, okay, taking 8 people's daily division of labor, one person deals with human food and special diets of some animals, the picky eaters. 3 people could be busy cleaning cages, half a person, or maybe half a day, shoveling waste from pit to pump, 1 person dealing with watering, 1 person dealing with feeding, and perhaps 1.5 people dealing with laundry, removal of waste, care, maintenance, miscellaneous responsibilities. They would need at least 22 extra large cages, 186 large cages, 293 medium cages, down to 308 bird cages, and 174 small cages, 415 amphibian cages. These are just some of the specs that the specialists have worked out that the ark can accommodate all this, which is more than would have been needed for Noah's purposes. Now, considering the different types of clean animals, you had to have 7 pairs. That's 14 of the clean animals. When people talk about the animals only went in 2 by 2, that's of the unclean. The clean animals, it was 7 pairs, or 14. So there would have been multiple, and most pictures of the ark don't show sometimes 14 of the same type of animal, but there would have been. So some of the animals are now extinct, sadly, but so they're putting them down there as well. So the ark, the number of the animals, depends on several factors. Coyotes, wolves, dingoes, domestic dogs can generally interbreed. They can thus be lumped into the same kind. And similarly, when it comes to bats, there are about 24 known families of bats living and extinct. So they have, in fact, depicted 300 bats on there. And so 7 of 14, it's 7 pairs of every kind. So it would mean they went in 2 by 2, a male and his female, and there were 7 of those for the clean animals. How do you differentiate between clean and unclean animals? Well, the Bible's very clear about that. And they show how they would have fit on the 3 different levels and how everything would have worked. You need your access positions, things would have been very organized. And then how would they have been bringing in or removing waste, bringing in water and removing waste, and the different technologies that were available at that time. So you've got all the different animals, the different decks, very detailed. I would not want the job of having proofread all this, the different scientific names for the different types of birds and aquatic animals and living birds and amphibians. But this is all the detail showing how everything could have fit in all the different amphibians and birds, extinct or living, and bats and so on. Next question, how could they have delivered sufficient drinking water? How could they have removed animal waste? How could they have sustained fresh air? How could they have provided sufficient light for 8 people and thousands of animals on the ark? Well, first of all, you can imagine you can have rainwater going into cisterns, which then are going from those big storage tanks into feeding systems. How could you have removed the waste? And of course, they would make use of gravity, and you could also have a moon pool in order to provide ventilation for the area. So, ventilation, here's a few possible air freshening techniques. The moon pool concept is a wave-powered purifier where you've got and I've seen ships that have that today too. A moon pool is generally used for drilling and research vessels, but the same concept could be used to exploit waves to pump fresh oxygen and air through the ark. It may seem strange to have a shaft or well inside the ark that opens the water, but a moon pool would be an extremely effective mechanism to provide a continual supply of fresh air. For example, because of gravity, the water would not rise higher inside as it's rising outside. And so the falling waves inside the moon pool can pull in fresh air, and as it decreases, the rising waves will push the fresh air through the shaft to the bottom deck, and the fresh air is directed to the lower level, ultimately bring air to all the other decks. And so this moon pool, where the water inside matches the water outside just by sheer gravity, would have worked. There could have been other methods to circulate air. Furnace fueled by animal waste could have been used to heat air and to create a draft in specially constructed flues and chimney systems. Another possible is that people or animal could have powered mechanical bellows or fans that could have been built to blow air through the ark. And many modern buildings that house large numbers of animals don't require special mechanisms for ventilation. Instead, they rely on natural convection currents to circulate air. In addition to possible openings on a roof, sufficient airflow could have been produced by temperature differences between cooled surfaces in the ark and body heat generated by warm-blooded animals. So how could you light the ark? Well, first of all, the roof had to have an opening to within 1 cubit of the roof. And so you can see how from the center they could provide light throughout. Sunlight through openings could have easily done it, because Genesis 6:16 speaks of build the roof and finish it to a cubit from the top. And so that could have easily provided light and fresh air. Also, sunlight through covering. Genesis 8:13 says, Noah removed the ark's covering as the earth dried near the end of their time on the ark. And the word used for covering refers to something other than the window that he used for the birds, and the opening depicted here, where he could let the bird out of the opening, but there's also the covering. And the covering may have been a section of the roof that could be drawn back to serve as a central skylight. And so here you can see you've got your moon pools and you've got your skylights. And that could work. You could have artificial lighting, of course, too, and sunlight through openings, sunlight through covering. Artificial lighting could have been used through olive oil as a long-lasting fuel, and it's not necessarily as safe as an option as an oil lamp, but you could have open flame sources like candles and torches as well. So the lighting, no problem with their design. In fact, you can see how there is tremendous natural lighting in the ark that they built through the central top skylights. Really great woodwork, wouldn't you say? is just impressive. What a lot of carpentry. And this is what I saw visiting there. So how could the ark have provided sufficient food for the thousands of species? Well, there's of course a lot of space for storage. And you can see in the ark there a whole range of the storage for sacks of food and grain, and for water containers or olive oil, as the case may be. And of course they would have been using wheelbarrows. But Noah's family may have used automated processes to handle many of the responsibilities related to animal care. Food and water systems could have been used to contain several days' worth of nourishment, allowing creatures to eat and drink whenever they wanted. So these water distribution and refillable feeders, such as pouring from a top passenger sort of galley, so the food would sift through, and as the elephant, in this case, eats at the bottom, then a bit more grain would come down the tube. And that could work. I mean, why would you make it difficult for yourself? And so these kind of smart feeders, you could imagine, would have saved a lot of time. They've got quite a few creatures depicted, and they don't look like a lot of our animals today, because they believe in many cases they would have changed. And so looking at some of the old extinct animal fossils, they've come up with some interesting ideas. And the giraffes don't look quite like ours today, and so on. But here you've got for water. The water's in this bowl, and it'll drop in the more that the water around it has been used. So they've got a range of systems for animal care. How could Noah's family care for thousands of animals? So they need workable models and manageable workloads. God commanded Noah to bring representatives of every land-dependent kind of creature on the ark, but providing for such a diverse assembly of creatures would have involved a lot of work. So based on Answers in Genesis calculations, each family member would have been responsible for an average of 850 animals, about 850 per person. But they don't necessarily have to feed them by hand. They could have had it in some kind of system like here, where you've got your water containers and your food smart feeders for each one. Reptiles and amphibians would have been housed possibly in these kind of clay pots with some cloth over the top. And those who eat insects, they could have organized away central cribs to house moths and other kinds of insects that could become food sources for many of the amphibians and lizards and chameleons and so on. So you've got your food container, you've got your water vessel, and so they're depicting a whole lot of intelligent ways that you could imagine Noah and his family could have handled, for example, picky eaters with specialized diets, and how do you look after vampire bats and anteaters? Well, anteaters thrive in eating ants, and they can devour 35,000 insects in a day. If you've got too many insects here, get an anteater. But anteaters in captivity can also be fed on fruit and eggs. And in the wild, giant anteaters consume fruit that's dropped to the ground as well. So you don't only have to feed an anteater with ants. What about koala bears? We know that they like eucalyptus trees, but they can eat wattle and paper bark and tea leaves. The fact that they prefer eucalyptus doesn't mean that that's the only thing you could have fed them with. And so there could have been a wider variety of food like grains, fruits, vegetables for the different animals. How could the ark have provided sufficient water for the thousands of species? Well, you've got rainwater, big cisterns and tanks. You could imagine that they could have funneled that to large strategically placed storage tanks, and a system of spriggets and bamboo, or even maybe copper pipes, could have delivered water throughout the ark. Due to the surface of the ark's roof, 1 inch of rainfall a week would have kept the cisterns full. So no danger of running out of water on the ark. Fresh drinking water for all. And what about small animals? Okay, how do you remove waste? Slotted floors in the cages, combined with a series of angled trays placed beneath them, would have moved the waste by gravity to collection trays at the bottom of the stack that could be quickly swept out and cleaned. I mean, that's a workable model. Okay, what about removing of waste? So you can see here that you've got your water coming from the roof into tanks, into systems, and then piped around. And now you've got how do you remove waste? Well, you've got angled piping, which is draining into some of these moon pool type storage tanks. So what you've got is a drainage system that can remove waste, and they can shovel them in. Okay, the question that was asked, what about Noah's family, and what's the possibility that you could get every race and tribe out of them? And they show that. Why are the living quarters so nice? Well, the idea that they just lived outside the ark, and once the rain came, they went in the ark. Well, when they're building it, they would have probably built comfortable quarters for themselves, knowing they're going to be a while on board the ark. They were probably living on the ark for the last many years of building it. And there's a lot of reasons for thinking the living quarters would have been very nice, because the Lord didn't inform Noah as to how long they'd be on the ark. And they knew it would be for a long time. And so having a comfortable place to relax and refresh would have been beneficial to keeping up morale, energy for the labor that they faced. So they are looking at the way those living quarters may have looked. And of course there would have been interest in music and artistry as well, and what they would have been depicting. So these are some of the exhibits that the ark encountered that give you a bit of an idea. Yes, there would have been reading and writing, playing musical instruments, and preparing food in the kitchens. And all of these have got their own stories and insights and the type of foods that they would have eaten. Of course, mostly vegetables and grain type products. Because only after the flood was Noah and his family told that they could eat meat. Before that, meat eating was not allowed by God. Not for people. Their stoves, the kind of ongoing vegetable, herbal gardens they would have maintained inside. And you can just see the huge amount of ingenuity and hard work that's gone into making this exhibit. And just to give us an idea to the tremendous labor of love this represents for Noah and his family. And the different utensils, baskets, vessels they would have used, and the kind of quarters they could have used, which could have included a hammock, which people in rocking seas often, like sailors, often use a hammock because, it's comfortable. Desks, plans, strategy, all of this would have been necessary because they had a major operation. This wasn't just a vessel to save them, but to save every species of animal on the planet. And that was a massive amount of work. Well, you can see the creativity, get the idea, and the idea that ancient man was somehow drag his knuckles bent over like a Neanderthal is just a false picture. And also the idea of the ark looking like some kind of bathtub turned upside down, as they said, is just not realistic. They were very cultured, they had many skills, and of course at that stage they would have had to make everything. There's no shops down the road, so they had to do all their own sewing, weaving, crafting, knitting, whatever had to be done. And here's depicted Noah trying to retrieve one of the birds, and in one of the questions there it says, "You don't look like you're over 500 years old," and he says, "I don't look any older than any other 500-year-old I know." And so there's quite a bit of good humor there too. Then, comparison with other flood narratives in different cultures around the world, and the post-flood world, and Babel, and evidence for worldwide flood, and there's a whole lot more. So you walk in there and they give you the different ark stories around the world. There's a lot of flood legends. In fact, we flooded with legends. Critics of the Bible often say that the biblical flood account was copied from ancient Babylonian or Sumerian flood legends, since those writings may have predated Moses. But it makes more sense to believe the biblical account reveals the true history of the flood, while the legends are distorted events of the same versions of the same event. So, the Aztecs and the Mayans have their stories of a big canoe, and the Incas have a massive sort of catamaran raft, and the Arawaks have a big canoe, and the Montegagnus another sort of canoe, and the Vikings have a big open boat, and the Greeks believed in some kind of box-shaped structure. And the LTX, another type of canoe, a junk from China. And in Africa, you've got giant canoes amongst the Rukwa and the Maasai people. The Hawaiians think of some kind of catamaran raft, same in Fiji. And so you've got everything from the Vanuatu tale, where they speak about a 50 feet by 10 feet structure. But that's a problem. There's no tree big enough to hold all the people and animals, and a canoe would quickly be swamped by the flood. So all of these different flood legends cannot work. They all are obviously a distorted version of something which stood originally. So you get this large coracle, the circular Acadian tablet, but that could not have worked either. And so looking at it from a point of view of seaworthiness and size, can it accommodate enough animals? Is it able to survive the stresses of the sea? Well, no. The raft will not work. Animals and people will be washed overboard. The raft would break apart. If it was large enough for all the people and animals and supplies, it would break. So these legends, like the box, well, that would be tossed up and down, and you couldn't even survive. So the Gilgamesh legend of the cube would not work either. But the Bible and the Bible alone has no problems. It's perfectly designed structure-wise to survive the flood, and it's large enough to accommodate all the animal species and people and supplies needed. Dimensions are ideal. There's over 200 legends of ancient floods that have been discovered around the world, global floods. While they vary in the level of consistency with the Bible, there's certain basic things. Normally talking about 8 people, a lot of animals, and a worldwide flood, and so on. Since the Bible is God's word, it's accurate in all that it records. The accuracy is not limited to matters of faith, but includes every subject the Bible addresses, including history. Only the dimensions of the biblical ark provide the ideal size and strength, stability and comfort for a ship built to protect the people and animals during the flood. And so there's a film. We'll see if we can find it also on how the different models could not work, sink or swim. Well, in fact, if you've been down to the coast and you've seen how hard the waves can batter some of our coastlines, then you would be aware of something of what Noah's Ark would have had to endure. In fact, a lot more than that in the global catastrophe. This ark had to be strong enough to survive the anger of the sea. And all the different options out there, there'd be no survivors. Only Noah's Ark. Only the Bible tells of an ark with the size and the proportions to protect its passengers from destruction, able to survive a year-long flood. Genesis 8:18 says, Noah and his family, along with all the animals, went out of the ark. And that's the biblical record, and that's the facts of history, and that's why we are still around here today. And common ancestry animals could have led to many of the different species in the dog or the ape category or the cat families. And one of the problems they look at there is the falsehoods. Because if Satan can convince us that the flood wasn't real, then he could perhaps convince us that heaven and hell aren't real either. Here's the Rainbow Covenant. These are just many different visions of the different creatures God used. And of course, these creatures didn't need to come in the ark. They would have managed quite fine, even though they would have been tossed upside down, would have been quite a trauma for them too, but enough would have survived the cataclysm of the flood of the sea creatures that we didn't need to worry about fitting them into the ark, which of course is a major amount of the species. So the catastrophe of the flood is critical to understanding our world. Ken Ham said that his interest in the ark and the flood was intensified when he read The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. The catastrophic event of the flood explains most of the fossil record, and it's integral to a full understanding of the topic of our origins.